Where was Paul shipwrecked in Acts 28, and what did he do while there? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 28, verses 1 to 10, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 28, verse 1, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 28, beginning at verse 1. Now when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta, and the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome, because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. In that region there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary. Paul is a prisoner on his way to Rome in order to make his defense before Nero. They left in the early fall, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. Due to the lateness of this voyage in the year, sailing was quite dangerous due to the violent storms that whip up on the sea in the fall and the winter. So it was obvious that Paul was not going to make it to Rome unless the weather was exceptional until the spring. As we read in chapter 27, though, the weather was not exceptional. In fact, it was downright ugly. Sailing from Palestine to Crete, they encountered strong enough winds that it had been determined to winter in Crete. The only disagreement was where. Would it be in Fair Havens, a place that wasn't really suitable to winter a ship in, but a city that they had made it to safely? Or would they risk it and travel to Phoenix, a place where the ship could be properly sheltered for the winter? The crew of the ship decided to risk it, which was a mistake. A violent storm kicked up, and for 2 weeks the ship was tossed to and fro, nobody knowing where they were. They only survived because Paul was on board and being protected by God. When they finally saw land, they didn't know where they were, but began sailing towards it. However, not knowing what land this was, they also didn't know the dangers that lay underneath the water, for the ship hit land that was underneath the water, destroying the ship. Everyone made it to land, but the ship was lost. The question now is, where were they? In chapter 28, we find out the island was Malta, a small island not too far from modern-day Sicily, which is, of course, just next to Italy, with Sicily being the stone the boot-shaped Italy appears to be tripping over when you look at it on a map. Malta was about 940 kilometers, or 585 miles from Crete, showing us just how powerful this wind was, for it was pushing them on average 67 kilometers, or 42 miles per day, over this 2-week stretch away from Crete and towards Malta. The natives of Malta could have been rather mean to Paul and those traveling with them, but they weren't. They were hospitable. It was still raining and cold, and it's highly likely that there were sick among those on the ship, so the natives kindled a fire and made them welcome. Unbeknownst to Paul, among the bundle of sticks and tree limbs that were gathered to sustain the fire was a viper, who, because of the heat, leaped out of the fire and attached himself to Paul. This viper would have been poisonous due to the reaction of the natives, thinking that Paul was a murderer, and this was the way of the gods seeking justice against a man that had escaped the bad weather on the sea. Paul, though, shook off the viper and didn't swell up, causing the natives to believe that Paul was a god himself. Now, Luke doesn't tell us that Paul denied this, but from other areas in Acts where he did, we can be confident that Paul did here as well, though unmentioned. What this was a sign that Paul had the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit prophesied by Jesus back in Mark 16, verses 17 and 18, which says, "And those signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons, they will speak with new tongues, they will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." Now, there are people who claim to have this power today, just like there are those who claim to speak in tongues. As we continue our walk through the New Testament, we're going to find that the age of miraculous spiritual gifts was temporary, which would have included this promise too. These gifts and the fact that snakes wouldn't harm those who had the gifts of the Holy Spirit was a sign to non-believers that Jesus' followers were speaking the truth in a time when the New Testament had not yet been written. That's exactly what it did here, for the people were amazed that Paul didn't die, meaning that they were going to treat him well and listen to what he said. While in Malta, Paul stayed at a home of the leading citizen of the island named Publius for 3 days. Now, the father of Publius had a fever and dysentery being an infection of the intestines that causes diarrhea containing blood or mucus. And it's a disease that Paul healed by praying to God and laying his hands on the man. Yet another sign for the people of Malta to witness. And just like it was with Jesus, when Paul performed this miracle, and it succeeded, more people were brought to him to be healed, and Paul healed them. Would Paul have preached to these people? Almost certainly. So again, we see the providence of God working behind the scenes to the furtherance of the gospel. Paul had suffered shipwreck, yet that shipwreck allowed people on the island of Malta to learn about Jesus. Certainly good things can come out of bad situations. But Paul couldn't stay on Malta forever. He needed to get to Rome. And so it was when the time came, the people of Malta provided them the things that were necessary to make the voyage. For remember, the cargo of the ship Paul traveled on was completely lost to the sea. So these provisions were desperately needed. We'll follow the final stages of Paul's journey to Rome, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 28, verses 11 to 16, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.